St. Lawrence River at Quebec, where shiploads of Irish boat people once arrived by the thousands.
Right, quick, top!
Now Quebec is holding the first St. Patrick's Day parade since 1926, a sign of a resurgence of all things Irish.
Happy St. Patrick's Day!
Yes!
Hello!
This crowd are the descendants of hundreds of Irish orphans adopted by Quebec families, children whose parents did not survive the passage from Ireland aboard the well-named coffin ships.
Irish power!
The parade organizers gave this band of descendants their own float when they heard their astonishing story. Fleeing famine in the spring of 1849, from the northern Irish port of Warren Point, a ship called the Hannah, carrying 180 Irish immigrants and a British crew of 12, sails for Quebec. Between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, they encounter pack ice. If you were fleeing Ireland and the Great Famine back in the spring of 1849, as were their ancestors, these are the icy waters between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia that you had to traverse. If you were aboard a wooden sailing ship and you had never run into ice before, these sounds might have put the fear of God into you.
This is steel.
And that was wood. It crashed at 4 o'clock.
Morning.
In the morning. And black dark on that. Well,
If you were sailing at night and in a storm aboard the bark Hannah, then your peril was greater than you had ever imagined. A reef of glacier ice, stretching as far as the eye could see, was waiting to tear the bottom out of your vessel and cast you in the darkness onto the ice-packed seas. These descendants are on a mission. From Ireland, artist Sharon Donnelly and her contractor husband, Padraig Carraher. From Newmarket, Ontario, Tom Murphy, he owns a tool and die company, and his mother Jane, a retired teacher. From Cornwall, Pat McCourt, he too a retired teacher. From Colorado, theater manager Maggie Mowbray.
I'm here because someone pulled my great-great-grandfather, who was 1 year old, out of the water.
one person.
Just one person.
We wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for them. And doesn't that really send a shiver through you?
Doesn't it? Yes.
Their quest, their voyage into the past, is simple. They want to know what really happened to their people in the years of the Great Starvation, what happened on the ice and before. This is Ireland's official memorial to the calamity. It remembers more than 1 million who fled their country on coffin ships like the Hannah, so called because so many died aboard of hunger and disease. The monument is haunting, but it's hidden away at a remote coast far from the capital. Haunting and hidden well describes the contentious story of the famine. All over the countryside, at least 1 million Irish are buried in mass graves. Mass graves are usually evocative of crime scenes. Perhaps, amid so many ruins from that time, that's why they're so difficult to find. In County Monaghan, there's one, signaled by a half-hidden sign on a back-country road. We got lost twice, trying to find it. Like the families aboard the boat, Sylvie Gauthier is taking her sister Isabelle on a journey into the past. The Gauthier sisters are from Quebec. They are trying to find a trace of their Irish great-great-grandparents, the Bradys. They know this much. Weakened by starvation, the Bradys fell victim to typhus, a fever that turns the body black as coal, the eyes red as fire, before it kills. They called it black fever. Breathe the infected air and you will die too. In memory of the millions of Canadians of Irish descent, this is a film about the Irish famine. Was the famine an act of God or mass murder? In County Armagh, in the shadow of a mountain called Slievegulian, this was once the most densely populated parish in all of Ireland. Down this lane in 1845 lived the Donnelly family. Their descendants still live in the original cabin.
Isn't it beautiful? Oh my
From Ontario, Jane and Tom Murphy come to meet lost cousins, Sharon Donnelly and her husband Padraig. Before the famine, a Murphy married a Donnelly, joining their family trees. Like half the people of Ontario, Jane has Irish roots.
Cousins, look at them.
That's
Hello,
flying.
Rihanna.
Hey.
I'm Jane Murphy.
Hello.
And this is Tom Murphy.
How are you? Hello.
Oh, Sharon, it's so good to see you.
Good.
Oh.
What's left of the Murphy home that was left behind is in the next field.
Although it's now this would have been some house. I guess the gate isn't even here. That would be the original fireplace, because you kind of see a piece of the cast iron right there.
The presence of a fireplace and even a window means the Murphys were a little better off.
Now you're telling me that that big Murphy family would have been confined to these two rooms?
That's right, yeah.
So
8, 9.
10. I'd say you're talking close to 12. We'll have to go now and look at the records. I'd say you're talking 12 people in these two rooms.
Yeah.
Wow. It's something, isn't it? And low, Tom. Look, and they think it's been raised a bit. It was much lower. Yeah, yeah.
Most Irish lived in 1 or 2 room cabins like this one preserved at the Ulster Museum.
This is the single room cabin. It was built in 1796. This is the sort of house that would have been occupied by some of the poorest people. We actually call them the landless poor. The roof thatching material was very poor quality. It was probably thatched with dead potato stalks and rushes. The floor would have been earthen. This is the bed outshot here. Do you see the way the wall goes out a little bit? Yeah. Now that wasn't the single bed. That was where Mum and Dad and occasionally the youngest child would have slept. It wasn't a one-off. 1 in every 3 people in Ireland lived like this. The man of the house probably was a farm labourer. His annual income would have amounted to about £12 a year. And in 1831, there was a family of 10 living here, 8 children and their parents. The basket of potatoes now, that was normal. Just about every meal, that's what you got served. The potatoes would have been boiled in a pot like this, drained and placed in the basket. Now you won't find any cutlery, you won't find a table here, you won't even find a cup. That's where the potatoes were placed. The little creepy stools were placed round it in a circle, and the whole family sat down and ate the potatoes, skin and all.
No cup to drink from, no plate to eat from, a pallet to sleep on. This is the life of the Irish poor. The potato has an astonishing place in Irish life. A field labourer can eat 14 pounds, 5 kilos a day. Often potatoes pay the rent. For 4.5 million Irish, the tater, the spud, is the difference between life and death. There's no film of the time, but this newsreel, shot during a later, lesser famine, shows the potato at the center of Irish life. The Irish are the poorest people of the Western world, with a life expectancy of 40. Potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day kept 3 million Irish alive. The landlords are never to be seen, but their agents extract in high rents every last penny, and if no penny, every last potato, from a people always on the brink of starvation. The lowly donkey plays a crucial role in the people's survival.
Oh, they don't want to scare the donkeys.
Look, here's these. What do you call these donkeys here?
Now they're kept as pets, but also as a remembrance of the hard times.
The wee brown one is a foal, and it's Buttons. And this is its mammy here, Bessie.
So what would they use the donkeys for, do you think? Does Grandpa ever put stuff on them and they carry? Here comes another one. Is that a donkey? Who?
Willow.
Willow. Well, they're pretty nice, eh?
The donkeys we have here now, Tom, is just for a hobby, you know. But they had a very important significance at that time, at the time of the famine, you know. And they would have been used primarily for carting about coal, bags of coal, and essentials that obviously people couldn't carry, you know. And they would have drawn just a single axle cart, and you could put your goods, or you could take it to perhaps the market in Uri. You would head off if you had a sow or something to sell that you could trade with, you know.
And bring back your heat and coal. And
bring back your coal or food, or, you know.
In County Monaghan, Sylvie Gauthier has tracked down the church where she hopes to find the records of her great-great-grandparents, Joseph and Attie Brady.
Hi, I'm Sylvie Gauthier. Nice to meet you. My sister Isabel.
This is the Church of Ireland, meaning the Bradys were Protestant. They were just as poor as the Catholics, but at least there was money to keep records.
I think you know we're looking for the records for our ancestor, Sarah Brady, who ended up going to Canada in '47.
Baptised the 22nd of September. Eliza Jane, daughter of Joseph and Natalia Brady of Foremast.
There is something magic about old hand-kept records, ink and parchment, sometimes revealing secrets. The sisters discover that their great-great-grandmother had a brother they knew nothing about.
There's another one?
There's another one. Thomas William, the son of Joseph and Natalia Brady of Foremast, born June the 15th and baptised June the 17th by me.
No, I don't know about this one at all. Nothing at all. Thomas William. Thomas William.
Yes, I think that 1832. Yeah, 15th of June.
The shadows are taking shape. This is the aisle the Bradys walked down to wed. This is the font where their children, including Sarah, were christened. The rituals of Irish life, all threatened by an apocalypse gathering on the wind. In 1845, the Ireland of the Bradys, the Murphys, and the Donnellys is an English province, so green and fertile that not only does it feed its own 10 million people, it sends enough food to England to feed another 1 million. This is Dublin Castle. Ireland was ruled from here during the famine.
So you're all very welcome to Dublin Castle. The original castle was built in the 13th century.
In their tracking of individual stories, our Canadian descendants discover that the famine is bound up with money and power. One of Ireland's leading historians on the famine says it is critical to understand where the power lay. Peter Gray.
One of the problems with Irish society is that it is very polarised socially. You have the perhaps 10,000 families of landowners who own virtually all the land of Ireland at the pinnacle of Irish society.
They are the 1% who own Ireland. Behind this wall lived Lord Bishop Alexander, the Murphys' landlord. Lord Alexander owned over 36 square kilometres in the north of Ireland. He was not only a lord, but a bishop in the Protestant Church. Historian Kevin Murphy.
The Murphy family and so on would have paid their rent. Now, in the 1840s, there was a middleman, but this was the head landlord, and the whole estate came here to pay rent. It was a massive house, this, and it looked out on the Bay of Dundalk, massive view. So everybody was trying to get as much rent as possible from the tenants with as little expense as possible.
Most of the Irish people speak only Gaelic, and in a time of deep hostility towards Catholicism, they are deeply Catholic. The British lion, the Irish monkey. Mass circulation magazines like Punch and even the Times newspaper routinely depict the Irish as apes, even calling them white niggers.
There are large sections of British public opinion which are inveterately hostile towards the Irish and which employ racialized language to denigrate the Irish.
The Ontario Murphys come to the archives looking for a trace of their ancestor, John Murphy, helped by researcher Deirdre Murphy.
Are we going to be pretty excited by this, Deirdre?
I hope so. When I went through the records, what I found was the letters that were written. Now, so the first one we have here is a letter from John Murphy about his bog.
Oh my goodness.
Looks like my signature. It does, I'm telling you, it looks like my T.
Yeah.
His J looks like my T.
Now,
out of the archival records comes the voice of John Murphy petitioning his old landlord for a section of land, drained swamp, perfect for growing more potatoes.
Sir, I propose to become a tenant to the Right Reverend Nathaniel Alexander, Lord Bishop of Meath.
For part of a spent bog that lies straight adjoining my small farm in the townland of Tullymacrieve.
I leave the rent and the value thereof to your honour's consideration.
Whatever you allow, I'm satisfied. Only continue me as your tenant, John Murphy.
Tom recognizes Murphy bargaining.
And then it says below,
I think 8 shillings per acre in abundance. Nevertheless, I refer all to your honour.
Well, this would be typically a Murphy thing at the end, a little amendment at the end. And you know what? Hang on. What I said above's fine, but
let's
not get too carried away. This is fair enough. You can almost lose that.
Yeah, it is almost like a Murphy.
In the memorable summer of 1845, the potato harvest is keenly awaited. The year before had been bountiful. John Murphy's plan for a few more acres of potatoes seems to have been ignored by the landlord, but barring a catastrophe, there'll be plenty of potatoes for the Donnellys and the Murphys. The hope of a bountiful harvest is about to come to a heart-stopping end. From the Americas, crossing in cargo ships and embedded in seed potatoes, the contagion that will crush a country is a spore invisible to the eye, Phytophthora infestans. The damp European air unleashes the spore in Europe. The wind carries it to parts of England, Scotland, and finally, to all of Ireland. 1 hour, the potato fields are green and growing. The next, they're putrefying, as if from a biblical plague. Starving people eat the rotten potatoes, and the dying begins. First the very young and the very old. Revolution threatens Europe. Governments take steps to calm the potato crisis. In some cases, forbidding the export of food. In others, importing tons of cheap grain to feed the people. The British Parliament leaves the fate of Ireland largely in the hands of her 10,000 landlords.
Many of them, I think, also see this as an economic opportunity to do what many of them had wanted to do for decades before the famine, to get rid of the population which had grown up to serve one form of economic activity, grain production, and replace it with pasture land and get rid of those people.
The landless poor are now at the mercy of a ruling class, 1%ers who see the famine not as a calamity, but an opportunity. They say the famine comes from God, to punish the lazy Irish. Incredibly, this oil is the only one painted during the famine that even begins to depict it. It shows a family discovering that their only food is too putrid to eat. The father, shocked, realizes they all face death by starvation. The Illustrated London News is the CNN of the day. They hire an artist to record the famine. He finds thousands starving to death amidst plenty. County Clare, Christmas 1847. The widow Connor prays over a dying child. The vicar waits to give death rites to John Mullins, dying of typhus. The O'Donnell boy dies of starvation. His mother and 2 sisters will be gone by spring. Evictions begin. Landlord gangs use crowbars and fire to eject the villagers of Moveen. By Christmas Day, like so much of County Clare, Moveen is a village of ghosts.
People do dig into their pockets in Britain, in America, in Canada, and in continental Europe as well to relieve Ireland. That's shifting by the end of the year. I think famine fatigue, good donor fatigue kicks in, but also an upsurge in agrarian violence as people in the countryside often resist evictions.
From across Ireland, tales of desperation roll in. Some families fight back. The artist captures tenant farmers defending cabins against a police gang. They hurl boiling water at the intruders. Resistance has a high price. Those who wield power in Ireland think themselves impervious, but one lord of the land goes too far, expelling thousands of his tenants, expelling them over the Atlantic to Canada. Major Dennis Mahon heads one of the 10,000 families that own most of Ireland. Taking advantage of the famine, he forcibly evicts 3,000 tenants who cannot pay the rent. In the Roscommon countryside, on the 2nd of November 1847, 3 men plot his assassination. At dusk, on a deserted road, they ambush the landlord and shoot him dead. The killers are tracked down and hanged.
Some people say he deserved it. Other people say this is the violent peasantry rising up to seize property and to engage in murderous activities. In the British press, it becomes ingratitude. This is Irish ingratitude. We give them money, we try to help them. They turn around and try to stab us in the back. So why should we assist them any longer?
Military towers built to keep an eye on a rebellious population now overlook a landscape of ruins. Historian Kevin Murphy.
I don't think we have any real grasp of how awful it was. For example, one of the eerie things about it that were mentioned by several travellers in Ireland at the time was that there was total silence. Children didn't play. There were no children out playing, and there were no dogs barking. The dogs were eaten. They were gone.
Stop.
And you see, the total silence was remarked on continually.
Sylvie Gautier's search for her Brady family is about to take an important turn. With the help of long-lost cousins, the Gautiers discover the ruins of their ancestral home.
So this would be the house.
This is what's left of the original Brady holding.
Would this have been the entrance here?
It would, somewhere there. It would.
That's the doorstep, is it?
Oh, there, was it?
What do you think happened? Why did they leave?
The famine.
Yeah.
And there were tenants.
Right.
And the crop failed.
Yep.
So they couldn't feed their family. You
So
know, it was a painful thing for people to have to leave their country and leave, you know, through circumstances of poverty.
Right.
So therefore, when the next generation came, they didn't talk about it.
As the starvation deepens, John Murphy and his fellow landless tenants make a distressing discovery. Their landlord, the bishop, is sending a small fortune, £1,000 every year, to convert India's Hindus to Christianity.
During the time of the famine, this £1,000 is going to India, and that £1,000 is coming, remember, from the rents of the tenants.
And did the tenants know this?
They did indeed, and if we look at the minute book here of the trustees from their meetings, the reasons which urge your petitioners to make this request are that whilst with severe toil they are daily striving to better their circumstances and have deprived themselves of many, even the necessities of life, in order to enable them to pay their rents with punctuality.
But it grieves us to find so much money, the produce of our industry, given to strangers in a distant part of the globe with whom we have no sympathies and whose social condition are in many aspects far superior to that of your petitioners.
John Murphy's angry plea finally results in the spending of £200 for a controversial soup kitchen.
And then into this business with the soup kitchen comes the religion aspect of it. This is a nightmare.
This churchyard in County Armagh holds terrible secrets. One of the landlords buried here joined with the bishop to father a cynical scheme. Starving Catholics are offered a Faustian bargain: sell their souls for a bowl of soup.
It was under the control of the likes of Meredith Chambry here, who was the landlord. Landlords got their, and then the church got in on the act as well. And they would get people to come to the church, take the soup, and that meant they changed their religion.
Some choose starvation over conversion, sending their children to be saved. First, hungry children have to endure a sermon. Their faces and young bodies show the signs of starvation. In the winter of 1847, the British Parliament receives confirmed reports that landlords are ejecting Irish tenant families in the dead of winter, allowing them to freeze to death. Proposing a new law to stop such outrages, Prime Minister John Russell suggests such landlords should be prosecuted for murder, saying if we put down assassins, we ought to put down the lynch law of the landlords. From his chateau, Lord Palmerston, the powerful Foreign Secretary and an Irish landlord, attacks the legislation. He says nothing should stand in the way of transforming Ireland by ejecting small farmers. The law is watered down. Ejectments would continue, but could not be done on Christmas or New Year's. Evictions take on a ruthless momentum. Police employ battering rams to smash homes to rubble. For those driven from homes and fields that they had worked for generations, the government has a solution. Report to the workhouse, they are told. Bring your family.
They're grossly overcrowded. People are coming in with diseases. You know, at one point, 2,500 people a week are dying in these institutions in 1848.
To enter, you had to sell everything. On entry, families were split up, children from mothers, wives from husbands. It was a cruel place.
As I come into the dormitory here, this is where the boys slept, I believe. And judging by the walkway here, these raised areas would have been where they slept on like straw beds. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would have been largely straw beds. Again, at times they may have had blankets, but a lot of boards of guardians, you know, they're quite parsimonious with the expenditure and they wanted to keep the rates down. So they might just keep it with straw as opposed to getting blankets.
In one account, the workhouse is described as a house of death, with the unfortunate paupers being nearly all victims of a fearful fever. The dying and the dead, we might say, huddled together. The masters became the victims of this dread disease. The clerk, a young man whose energies were devoted to the well-being of the Union, has been added to the victims. The matron, too, is dead.
To come in here to this place that you had to surrender up your land or you couldn't come in here, correct?
Yeah, that's true. You know, you had to give up your land. So like the whole idea was to come into a workhouse, to receive assistance in an institution like this, in a workhouse, you had to be destitute. You weren't entitled to it if you weren't destitute, if you weren't truly, truly desperate. And the thinking behind that was that, well, if you had land, you're not destitute.
Where did the people go? Where were they buried?
Well, and this was a massive problem with people entering the workhouse, was if they died in the workhouse, and what would happen to them is that they would be buried in a pauper's grave. This was something that people did not want to happen to them. An unmarked pauper's grave, it was one of the worst things that could happen to them, because they're not even associated with the poor Lord during life, but also forever in death.
I look at this place and I, quite frankly, it's terrible.
It's like a concentration camp.
Oh, it is. It is.
A lot of landlords believe that the only future for them and the only future for Ireland, that's the way they rationalise it, is to remove what they regard as the surplus peasantry from the land, and often out of their homes as well. So there's nothing for them to go back to once they get out of the workhouse, if they ever get out of the workhouse. There's no home, there's no land, the cottages are pulled down, right? So people really have nothing to go back to. Emigration is the only option if they survive.
The Almighty sent the potato blight, wrote one observer, but the English created the famine. The evidence was on the hoof. All across Ireland, people saw there were hundreds of thousands of livestock that could stop the starvation. Surely, now that a calamity is confirmed, this livestock will not be shipped to England. But they are wrong. In 1846, the second year of the famine, 900,000 livestock and tons of grain are taken out of Ireland, enough to feed everyone.
It is extremely controversial, both at the time and afterwards, that food continues to be exported from Ireland during the Great Famine. And significant amounts, particularly of wheat, barley, and livestock animals, are exported during the famine. They're exported because these are not things that the poor eat. They can't afford to eat them, right? The poor eat potatoes, or in some of the better off parts of the country, they eat oatmeal as well.
Pat McCourt, a retired schoolteacher from Cornwall, Ontario, is another Canadian descendant of the Irish boat people. He's been combing the archives, weighing the evidence, and he's disturbed by what he's finding.
Given what you say then about the difference between the classes and the great divide between them, would you say then to solve their problem, was the famine an act of God or was it an act of genocide?
I think it is both. It is an act of God in that had there not been an outbreak of this completely unprecedented ecological disaster, the potato blight, there would have been no famine in Ireland. Government officials actually say this. Edward Twistleton, who was the head of the Poor Law in Ireland, says after his resignation in spring 1849, for a relatively small amount of money in that year, people could have been kept alive. And that's what he uses the term extermination, which is a very strong term.
The idea that it is also genocide is raised by Britain's own governors, who say that by refusing to send enough help, Parliament is party to an act of extermination.
No landlords starve during the Great Famine. It is the poor who starve, those who don't have resources.
It is impossible to know how many Irish perished during the Great Starvation, partly because the government refused to do an official count. But a sympathetic Protestant member of Parliament named John Mitchell did a calculation. 1.5 million men, women, and children were carefully, prudently, and peacefully slain by the British government. They died of hunger in the midst of abundance, which their own hands had created. Potatoes failed all over Europe, yet there was no famine, save in Ireland. Today, 6 northern Irish counties are still ruled by the British Crown. During the famine, all of Ireland had Victoria as their queen. The Irish asked for food. The English sent the young Queen Victoria in all her glory. During the famine, she paid an expensive state visit to Ireland to try and raise morale. In the streets, the children sang, "Arise, ye dead of Skibbereen, come to Cork and see the Queen."
So Victoria was around 23 years old, and her first visit to Ireland was in 1849. So her very first visit was marked with much controversy. However, she did supposedly wear a green dress to try and accommodate her Irish visit and the Irish people who were here to greet her.
She comes, that grandiose amount of money is spent, and the people are literally dying in the streets. And then she goes back home, and there is a mention of her saying, the poor Irish people, but there isn't anything done about it.
It's deliberate. I mean, she is kind of brought to Ireland by the government as a kind of emblematic bookending of the famine. Say the famine is over. Queen's visit represents the return of normality. It's safe to invest in Ireland. If anyone wants to buy land in Ireland, they should follow the Queen's example and come and see what's happening. And of course, everything else is swept. There's still huge numbers of people, often children, orphans in huge numbers in the workhouses, are just swept under the carpet and ignored.
Sylvie Gautier's pursuit of her past began earlier with help from the O'Grady's.
How long was it since you were here?
Oh, too long. 7 years.
Oh.
Can you imagine? How are you doing?
They even encouraged her to learn Irish.
How are you? It's
I'm
years.
okay. How are you?
Are you still doing the Irish?
You're going in.
You're going in.
It's my sister Isabel.
Oh, Isabel, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I put on the kettle in case you'd be coming.
Yes.
Oh, no.
I'm so glad to be here. You have no idea. So we can come back?
Like many Irish families, the O'Grady's are still trying to come to grips with the Great Starvation in all its horror.
Wouldn't have been too bad.
Oh, you're a handsome fella anyway.
Now you can go to hell for lying. And it was a strange thing that in Ireland we never really mourned the whole famine and all of what went on until 97 was the beginning of it. And there were so many sad little stories that came out at that time. It was extraordinary. You know, one of the ones was that there was a man from Newbliss, and he broke a window because he wanted to be put in jail. And then he wasn't put in jail because they decided that there were enough in jail, and he was sent off home, and he died at Catulvan Bridge, just about a mile outside of the town of Monaghan. Even now, it makes me feel so weepy, you know, and we never really talked much about it, and my parents never talked about it. My grandfather was born on the 3rd year of the famine, 1849, you know. They never spoke about it.
Now, why do you think that is?
Because I think it was too deep, too traumatic. You know, the Irish were not good at talking about the hardships of the old days at all. They never, I think they just turned the page and kept going. You know, that they had a great lot of strength in them, I think.
I think it was guilt. They felt guilty that they didn't resist. I'd say, you know, that was probably, there was a terrible guilt until the couple of generations had passed, and then suddenly, well, of course, we became more affluent then, and it was when you had reached that stage, you didn't mind talking about your past, but up until we became prosperous, that we were ashamed to talk of our past.
There was a great silence about the famine here, in that the people didn't talk about it. And whether we like it or not, the people who remained here, that would be Sharon's ancestors and my own and so on, as opposed to yours, were the survivors. And very often the survivors had a lot to hide, because we didn't just all die together. People hoarded grain and let it out at inflated prices. They waited on their neighbours to die or emigrate so that they could get a lease of their land from the agent or landlord. So there was an interest in not talking about it. Plus the fact, and I found this about the 1798 rebellion here too, there was such a horror that people didn't talk. They were actually dumbstruck.
Somehow the Murphys and the Donnellys make it through the early famine years, 1847, 1848, but by the winter of 1849, things are beginning to look desperate. For the Murphys and the Donnellys, the moment comes with heartbreaking force. A little Murphy daughter, 6-year-old Bridget, is alone in the house. No one knows how the fire started. The house burns to the ground, consuming Bridget.
Now, my big question is, was the thatch set on fire?
Yeah.
But they lost a girl, a wee girl in it, and shortly after got on the Hannah.
I'm not surprised they probably left for Canada, because every time you'd look left, right, walk down the Lonan, you'd be reminded of your child and the child running around. You know, I would have to get away. I'd have to move. So I'm not one bit surprised they left. Yeah.
And so, a small story of the famine unfolds, triggered by the death of a Murphy child in a fire. The potato crop fails again. The family gets word of a better life in a promised land called Canada.
Farewell to the groves of shillelagh and shamrock.
The music goes, farewell to the groves of shillelagh and shamrock. Farewell to the girls of old Ireland all round. May their hearts be as merry as ever I would wish them. When far away across the ocean I'm bound.
When my father grows old and my mother's quite feeble.
And the tears in great drops down the cheeks they are rolling. Though the green fields of Canada, they daily are blooming. It's there I'll put an end to my misery and woe. For the landlords and bailiffs in vile combination, Having forced us from Hearthstone and Homestead away, may the Crowbar Brigade all be doomed to damnation when we're on the green fields of Canada.
This is where they would have come, been walking out through.
And you can see here, Jane, like it's a narrow entrance.
Finally, it's time to go. This is the very road their great-grandparents took in leaving Armagh, walking 25 kilometers to the seaport at Warren Point. In Warren Point, this plain monument marks the place of departure for tens of thousands leaving for the green fields of Canada.
Well, here it looks like it's here.
This is the monument that was erected by the... I think they would have had to stay here for a few days before they took sail.
So they could have been in rain and wind and no money, sitting outside, right here in the square.
Coming in lined up, is that one yours? And
Then you have to remember there was a lot of ships actually sailing out of here with food on them.
Oh, now wouldn't that have been heartbreaking?
You know? So if you're getting on a ship because you had no food and no livelihood to make a new life in a different country, and your neighbouring ship beside you was a cargo ship.
England, this would have been a little uneasy. This situation down here would have been pretty uneasy.
In the spring of 1849, the Donnellys prepared to say farewell to their Murphy cousins. Tom Murphy's great-great-grandfather John, potato farmer, is going to sea for the first time with his wife Bridget and 6 surviving children, saying goodbye to his sister, Sharon Donnelly's great-great-grandmother. The Murphys had no idea that the boat they are taking, the Hannah, is sailing into unimagined peril.
We could take this shell here for one of our souvenirs to say where you came from, right? And then yes, and then we could go out there, we'll get on a boat, and then we'll go to Canada.
No.
Well, you said you would. Why not? You take your mom and your dad.
I thought you wanted to go on a boat.
Yeah.
No?
Probably have to be doing this, lots of everybody being patient and coaxing and
A lot of coaxing.
and keeping.
Coming over. What, the water coming, getting closer? Yeah.
In Dublin, these stark figures represent more than the million Irish people who, like the Murphys and the Bradys, in 7 years of famine, took flight from the surrounding apocalypse.
Quand quelqu'un vit des expériences comme ça, c'est quelque chose, je pense, qui se transmet de génération en génération. Je pense que c'est pour ça que, en tout cas, moi, je ressens un genre d'attachement, de toute façon, à ce pays-ci, oui.
Nearby, the replica of a coffin ship, much like the one the Bradys took.
And this is the bunk that you'll be sharing if you'd like to accustom yourself to the bunk. Would you like to try it out?
Oui. Oh, you go first.
Okay.
In New Ross, this second tall ship is also a floating museum. It's much like the Hannah, the vessel that the Murphys and many neighbors took. The journey would be fraught with peril, but it began as an adventure.
Hello. Welcome aboard our ship. We're going to begin the tour around the capstan of this part of the ship right here. So if you'd all like to form a circle around which, I will begin to describe what we're all looking around right here. The vast majority of these famine ships were originally constructed in Quebec, in Canada. The main reason for that being was that the timber required to build such ships simply were not found in Ireland at the time. When the famine broke out, all of these vessels went through a radical departure and change, in the sense that they now became passenger vessels to accommodate the many thousands of people who would now use this as they escaped the country from famine, starvation, and death itself. I should also mention it would have taken at least 2 months to get across the Atlantic Ocean on vessels like this, weather depending. It could have been even longer. It was time we went to below deck now and had a look and see what our home would have been looking like for that particular journey itself. Welcome down, everybody. What you're all looking at now at the moment is the infamous steerage section. This is where at least 95% of the passengers on board, this is their home. Bearing in mind that almost nobody on board had ever seen a vessel like this, let alone the sea, one can only imagine how rough it must have been for people. On an average day, when the companionway is closed, we are sealed down here for all day long, all week long, it depends.
Hopefully you've brought a supply of oatcake with you, because this is what people survived on. It's oatmeal, warm water and salt, rolled out, dried out in front of the fire for several hours. And the night before people emigrated, they had what they called a living wake, and the neighbours came with oatcake to give them for the journey. It lasts for weeks, and with a drink of water, it swells up in your stomach, so you feel you've had a lot to eat. And that's how people survived when the weather was stormy and no food was cooked.
Jason, I read in Keegan's diary that terrible storms would come up and these people would be thrown from one side to the other. Very few of them would escape having physical injuries.
Oh, absolutely. Remember, these bunks in particular are built very unstably. This was not supposed to carry passengers in the first place. It's primarily a cargo vessel. So, as you said, during storms, literally in most cases, the bunks would literally crash down on top of those that's trying to sleep and rest below them like that.
How many people, Jason, would be confined to a single bunk?
It's a good question. It depends on the size of your family. If there was 4 or 5 people with you, that does you for the whole journey.
One bunk per family?
Absolutely. But that was a typical scenario as the famine worsened and immigration doubled. You could have had up to 2 families per bunk.
You wonder how that's actually physically possible.
It is. It's amazing.
To survive in a bunk.
Yeah. One of you would like to try and fit in yourself and have a look. You basically had to fend for yourself and bring whatever supplies you had with you. Best exemplified by the pots, pans and blankets on board. You wore the same clothes for the most part of your 2-month journey. You were given seawater to wash your clothes and yourself with.
Each passenger endured their own drama.
Quand les Brady sont venus, la mère était probablement malade parce qu'elle est morte en arrivant.
So you might have had up to 200 people down here. People during the famine years were already weak, coming on board ship. Some of them were already ill, and of course they had no resistance really to disease, you know. And lice, of course, spread typhus, you know, and rats, of course, spread disease as well.
The ship owners spent the least amount of money possible to house the immigrants. The results below decks became unimaginable.
8 of the Murphys in there, where you 2 are all crammed into there.
Think of yourself, Tom, and your 3 boys and Samantha in there.
Yeah, and how, like, we all have little kids. I just can't imagine everybody in there, in that one little place. And then somebody getting sick, you know.
Up top getting sick and it
leaking
seeping
down. Into the bottom.
Bottom bunks were actually the worst place on board to stay
And initially you would think, I'll take this bottom bunk.
Sure, but they're actually the worst because you had to put up with the constant spillages from the guys on top of you who were sick and who were too weak to get out of their bunks to go to the toilet, for instance.
Something as basic as toilet facilities adds to the suffering. Imagine an overflowing bucket.
So there was one of these under each bunk, and that was taken up and emptied over the side during the day.
Right.
Unfortunately, in stormy weather, the hatches were battened down, and as long as the storm lasted, the buckets were not emptied.
Nothing was thrown away.
The buckets would be tipping over, there'd be feces all over the place.
Yes.
Kids who don't understand, and we all have kids even these days, they'd be getting out and their feet walking in, trampling it back into here. So you're just bound, like you're bound for disease in here.
If there were so many people per bunk too, you had to take turns in sleeping. So for the most part, if you could not fit in there, you had to try and sleep on the floor, amidst everything you just described as well.
I've been here 5 minutes, I think. I feel very cramped. It's my back starting to hurt. It's a hard surface. There must have been a lot of babies. Yes, children, people crying, people sick, people dying. I can't imagine, and I'm glad I can't imagine. I feel very thankful I can't imagine, but it must have just been horrendous. Our great-great-grandmother was 10 years old when she crossed.
Yes.
And being a child is having that kind of start to your life and then ending up doing what she did, because she ended up marrying, having children who ended up having very large families. I don't see how, to imagine that was the outcome of this crossing is quite something, really, when you think about it.
If someone passed away during the night in their sleep, or simply due to the illnesses on board of many, typhus, cholera, you name it, they were simply wrapped up in blankets, taken up aboard and thrown over deck silently amidst a silent prayer. Now, coming up next, we have a passenger on board who's going to share with you all of her experiences on board right here in steerage.
Free passage, the landlord said to us last autumn. You can have free passage to a new land, a better life. I think he just wanted us off the land myself. I said to David, I will not go into the workhouse. He said to me, my children will have it better than me. Where is Canada? Sure, I never left the estate before. All I know is we had to go. It took us 2 days' travel to get here. The landlord let Jack, the houseman, come with us on the cart. We brought all we could carry, but the captain told us to leave much of it on the cart as there was no room. This is where we must live, all of us. We had more room in the hovel, but at least it's dry here. And this is some of the food that we have to eat for the week, for the 6 of us. I don't mind going without, but I worry that the children will be hungry.
What did the kids think? What do they think of travelling on the boat?
Oh, they want to be up on the top deck all the time looking around, but sure, we're not allowed up. The smell of the buckets is horrible. Absolutely horrible. And with the bit of a storm we had last week now, they wouldn't allow us up to empty the buckets. So they were starting to overflow down here. It was horrible.
Puis nous, on est en forme.
In the measurement of misery in all of these ships, the Brady's vessel will prove to be one of the worst of all. The living came to envy the dead. The coffin ship Hannah, with 180 passengers crammed below decks, sails from Ireland on the 3rd of April, 1849. A crab boat has picked up our descendants on Prince Edward Island, heading for the ice pack where the Hannah ran into trouble.
Where we fit into this is that John Murphy had on the Hannah Catherine, Patrick, Rose, Barney, and that's where we fit in, and twin boys. As a beautiful...
Jane's genealogist husband, Pat, is home dying.
It started out so small, like you could almost cry. It started out so small, and it was just Patty phoning over to him. Oh, this isn't put on. And Sharon, like, you must be sitting there thinking, here I am over in Canada, where all this happened, and your people came here. Your flesh and blood were on that ship.
I mean, I'm so far away on the other side of the world, really, in my terms.
But Sharon, look at that too, of these people that left. That John Murphy, and he leaves his sister Bridget.
I miss my boys a lot. Last night I kind of cried in bed for a little bit thinking about it's really hard to leave them, even for a couple days. But then I think this is so important and what an amazing opportunity. And I want to share that with them when I get home, you know? And now that I'm pregnant with my third, he's on this boat with me, you know what I mean? And I'll get to tell him about it. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
The famine ship Hannah has made a rapid Atlantic crossing, reaching Canadian waters in just 3 weeks. So far, the greatest danger facing the passengers, especially the young women, was the 23-year-old captain himself. That's the testimony of the ship's doctor, William Graham. Later in a Quebec City hospital, where he lies suffering from acute exposure, the doctor denounces the captain.
I would remark that the general conduct of Captain Shaw was not such as to command the respect due to the master of an immigrant vessel. I have seen him on several occasions getting into the sleeping berths of unmarried women, to the great scandal and annoyance of the orderly passengers.
Pat McCourt's great-grandfather is aboard the Hannah.
I guess we would call it rape, what he was doing. He was crawling into the bunks of the young women, much to the consternation of the other passengers.
After the crossing from Ireland, the Hannah is heading for the strait that separates Nova Scotia from Newfoundland. It's snowing. The winds are gale force, but the Hannah is not slowing down. Suddenly, there's the sound of the wooden bottom of the ship being ripped open by the ice. The Hannah comes to a dead stop.
I was roused by the screams of the affrighted women and children.
You can hear the crew shouting up above, and you're just frantically looking for your children because it's pitch black and you're just trying to gather them close to you. You know there's something happening. It's the ship going down.
Our Murphys are trying to find 6 children and get them close to them because they really do know there's a problem here.
But everybody's obviously panicked.
Mm-hmm.
We're all going to be trying to get up out of here.
Captain Shaw ran into the cabin and from thence to his stateroom, from which he took his chronometer, his writing desk, and a cutlass.
Surgeon Graham says that he grabbed his instruments, his writing desk, and a cutlass, and he rushed out, at which point the surgeon now asks him,
I said to him, are the passengers likely to lose their lives? To which he answered, no, but I think we will lose the ship.
and then he disappeared up the gangway.
So he's already packing up to go.
Well,
he's probably knows that they're destitute or the ship's going to sink.
I think at that point, Pat, too, he's given instructions to the crew.
Yeah, good point.
To nail shut the trapdoor leading down to the passengers.
I was informed by a Mrs. Murphy, a highly respectable passenger, that Captain Shaw and the carpenter, in her presence, nailed down the after hatch to prevent the escape of the passengers from below.
You started trying to get up the
there'd
stairs?
be a
rush.
A rush of people trying to get up, and then the thing is closed.
And then they nailed it down.
When one of the sailors, Timothy Hackett, tore it open, saying, no, this is too bad. Let us give them a chance for their lives.
I look at this guy now as like he's a villain. Like, this guy's coming in, save his own skin. He's done enough bad stuff. But he's like, I'm getting out of here and I hope everyone goes down.
When he jumped from the ship onto the ice, from which he made his way to the lifeboat, which was waiting for him at close distance, with the first and second mate and some of the crew.
What was the time that it sunk in?
40 minutes.
40 minutes. So by the time you're getting up here, it's evident that you're in a bad situation. Freezing water coming in.
I also leapt on the ice, but in doing so, was disabled in one of my limbs.
The surgeon jumped off, broke his leg.
In this state, I rolled myself into the sea and swam after the boat.
Surgeon Graham, broken leg and all, plunges into the icy water in pursuit of the fleeing captain.
Upon nearing which, the captain stood up and made several blows at me with a naked cutlass. On which I was obliged to make my way back to the ice.
Only 40 minutes elapse between the time the Hannah first strikes the ice and when she disappears beneath the waves. But through some incredible feats of bravery, about 120 of the 180 passengers are still alive. In this Arctic landscape, every step is dangerous. Back then, few of the people had boots. A desperate John Murphy puts his twins, Felix and Owen, on an ice floe thinking it's safe. He leaves to rescue the baby, 3-year-old Rose. Miraculously, Murphy finds Rose in the icy waters. The baby isn't breathing. Rose survives the ordeal, but is so traumatized she will not speak for 3 years. When he turns to bring the twins back, the Murphys realize they are disappearing in the mist.
Tom, you have young boys yourself. If you were stuck out on an ice floe, would that be instinctive to you? I know I'm a parent and I have 2 small girls, and to think that you could see them drifting away, like, you're going to jump in.
You're going to go after them. There'd be no question. It would be instinct just to go after them.
How do you think you'd feel coming back?
Coming back
without them?
Exactly. And how would you feel for the rest of your life?
Yeah.
The last picture of your two young boys is going away, and you never see them again.
Or maybe them crying or calling out.
Screaming probably for you, and you yelling at them, you know?
Every Hanna family is in the middle of their own life and death drama.
In the chaos, in the black dark, we have a lady by the name of Anne McGinn. She has 6 children with her. Her husband Barney is waiting on the docks in Quebec. And she's searching for these children, somehow gathers them up, only to lose all of them off the ice.
Our descendants stand in for 120 desperate Irish people. The odds are not good. One by one, they begin to fall, succumbing to the awful temptation of death by freezing, where as you die, your body feels warm. In the darkness, the sound of prayer, praying for a miracle in the Arctic mist. At 4 o'clock the next afternoon, out of the mist appears another famine ship, the Nicaragua. Risking his vessel, the captain heads for the ice. Looking back, it seems nothing short of a miracle. Somehow these desperate Irish immigrants survive 17 hours on the ice. William Marshall is captain of the Nicaragua. We found his direct descendants, Alan Evans and his son, Nathaniel.
It's like a dream, really. It's just something that up until about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I just didn't dream would be possible. You know, and even the fact that we'd actually be able to speak to people who are descendants of those that survived was something which was something I would dismiss if the thought ever came in my head. It was it would be too amazing a scenario, you know.
Alan and Nathaniel. Alan is the great-great-grandson of Captain Marshall, who rescued our ancestors. Yay! You think And you look like him. You
Thank
do.
you.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. What did you think of your ancestor, Captain Marshall, when you saw all this going on and saw all of us and we're all telling our stories? And how did you feel about him?
Well, I feel he's a tremendous outstanding character, you know. But I know enough about the man that he wouldn't want to take any credit for it, because his Christian faith was such that he would have wanted to defer any of the glory, you know, to God. The window of opportunity for the rescue was so narrow. There were so many coincidences, if you like, that had to play their part in that he was just a bit player in the whole thing.
I think the man is a total hero.
For sure.
A total hero, and I think he did it because of his love of God, but I would hope also because of his love of mankind, that he didn't see those people the same way that Captain Shaw saw them as below him.
I'm here because someone pulled my great-great-grandfather, who was 1 year old, out of the water.
One person?
Just one person.
We wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for them. And doesn't that really send a shiver through you?
That's it.
Yes.
What of the Hannah? Could the coffin ship ever be found?
But from Cape Ray to the Cursor is 27 miles east-southeast. That's where the Hannah is, approximately.
You think that there's probably something still down there?
There's 350 fathom of water there. Probably the whole ship would be intact, I think, with the cold water.
With the cold water?
And the depth.
Mom said, yeah. That you would think that it's here to find some salvation, that we're...
all of a sudden the reality of,
The Gautier sisters continue their search for their Irish roots. This is the St. Lawrence River near Quebec. In the distance, Gros Isle. During the potato famine, it was a quarantine station. All ships from Ireland were required to stop here. This is where Sarah Brady and her parents came ashore.
rendu sur l'île aussi avec les hôpitaux, les gens malades, les gens qui mouraient tous les jours, des fois par dizaines, par vingtaines, 40, 50 par jour des fois. Là.
In August 1847, their famine family, the Bradys, were ordered ashore. Joseph and Addie had caught typhus. 10-year-old Sarah had escaped it. The mother and father were crammed into a shed with dozens of others. Death by typhus is ghastly. The veins swell black, the eyes burn red. There's no cure, and there wasn't for the Bradys. 10-year-old Sarah, their great-grandmother, was left an orphan.
C'est ici que Harry et Joseph sont enterrés. Quand les bateaux arrivaient, il y avait les gens malades qui débarquaient, mais tout le monde débarquait. Puis les gens qui étaient déjà morts étaient enterrés ici, directement. Il y en avait 3 ou 4 de profond, empilés les uns sur les autres, puis ça arrivait des fois qu'ils étaient déterrés par les rats parce que c'était tellement à la surface que...
This is the biggest mass grave for famine victims outside of Ireland. For the summer of 1847 alone, there are more than 5,000 buried here. Many are remembered on this memorial wall.
Fait que ça, il y a 47, 47, 47, tout ça, tout ça, tout ça. T'arrives... Addie? C'est Joseph. Oh, and Addie.
On the island, a massive Celtic cross bears some telling lines, different versions of the Great Starvation.
It's really kind of interesting on this monument because there are different messages in the different languages addressing different issues, kind of thing. Where, you know, usually on a monument you have a translation of something, a text that says the same thing. Well, here is, for instance, in the French text, it says, "To the pious memory of thousands of Irish who, to keep the faith, suffered famine and exile, and victims of the typhus ended their painful pilgrimage, consoled and fortified by the Canadian priest." And then there's those who sow in tears will reap in joy, so from the Bible. So this is obviously for the Canadian priest. So on the other side, there's an Irish language one that I will attempt to read. O Gorta Trenach is na blianti 1847-48, Banachti Dealish J. Ora. The Irish people perished in their thousands on this island, fleeing from the tyrannical English laws and the famine that took place in 1847-48. God bless the Irish. And then it says that this monument was erected to honor the people from the Irish of America.
Now that's a completely different message.
Yes. Totally different
than the other
There's
three.
There's a political side.
Yeah, exactly.
That's most interesting.
The Gautier search has taken them across the world in search of Sarah Brady. But one question remains. Who rescued the little orphan Sarah from the quarantine station at Gros-Île? Now the search takes them to Quebec and the archives. Arriving in Gros-Île, 10-year-old Sarah was a passenger on the Erin's Queen.
Journal de Québec du 14 juillet en 47. Donc ça devrait nous montrer l'arrivée du bateau.
The ship's death toll was staggering, so much so that the captain and his crew took desperate action.
We learned from the exchange register that the ship Erin's Queen from Liverpool, with 517 passengers at Gros-Île, since last Tuesday has been abandoned by the captain and crew.
Ah.
She had 50 deaths on the passage.
Hundreds of Irish orphans were adopted by Quebec families. Those records are carefully kept, if you know where to look. Now a Canadian census document contains a big surprise.
Census. Oh!
3 names: Nicholas Hackett, Catherine Hackett, the family that adopted Sarah Brady.
Well, I guess it... I guess I can't say. It's like, I think I'm just glad somebody took her. And obviously cared enough for her that she made it through.
You found little Sarah. How does it feel?
Well, on this, she was 13, so I imagine they took her probably in 47, 48. It's hard to know that part, but it is, she had a home, and it's kind of like what Maggie was saying, you know, it's like if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't be here.
They'd be buried.
This bronze celebrates the story of how Quebecers opened their hearts and homes to the starving and desperate Irish.
And then over there, you see him kind of putting the corpses down. Maybe right there.
There is an abiding mystery around the Hannah. We know that Captain Shaw escaped in a longboat and was brought to Quebec City. He told officials that all his passengers had perished when the Hannah sank. When confronted with 129 survivors from the ice, he changed his story. He brazened it out, saying, "How can you take the word of these Irish?"
To the editor of the Quebec Mercury, Sir, I find that at a meeting held on Wednesday evening last, the president of the St. Patrick's Society, in his speech on that occasion, commented in a very derogatory manner upon my conduct in reference to the passengers under my charge. Individuals whose knowledge on such occasions is based upon the supposition that a captain of a ship is bound to save the lives of his passengers under any circumstance, are a party governed by feeling and reason. Let me ask that individual how, on such an occasion, he would conduct himself if placed under similar circumstances. With between 100 and 200 souls around him, each one looking to the captain to save him, the ship sinking under him, and only the brief space of about 40 minutes before she went down and the ice closing over her.
Surgeon Graham swore out a deposition against the actions of Captain Shaw.
This violent proceeding was the more uncalled for, as the boat was by no means overcrowded at the time. In this hour of danger and distress, Captain Shaw pulled away and never returned to render the slightest assistance to the unfortunate passengers who were thus abandoned to their fate without clothes or provisions by the person to whom they naturally looked for protection and support.
Surgeon Graham never recovered. He died in a Quebec hospital on the 7th of June, 1849. The 23-year-old Curry Shaw escaped to justice, even returning to captain another of his father's ships. But now perhaps justice is about to emerge from a shoebox.
Well, in this box.
From his home in Wales, Alan Evans has brought the holy grail of this story.
Presented by the St. Patrick's Society of Quebec to Captain William Marshall of the bark Nicaragua for his spirited and humane exertions in rescuing 129 passengers of the brig Hannah from Newry from perishing on the ice in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the 29th day of April 1849. And I'd just like to give you a chance to pass it around now and have a look at it and get a feel of it.
For more than 160 years, this silver goblet has been kept precious by Captain Marshall's descendants.
I believe we all have a calling or a meaning to why we're dancing on this earth. And I think today it's become very obvious why you are the person that inherited this goblet. I think it's remarkable that the heresy that your ancestor showed to save these people, and as a result of it, all these other people here today with us, and lovely people they are too.
Oh, bless you. The tongue of the Irish.
And I hope it lasts for another 150 years.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
The Hannah survivors, like tens of thousands of Irish boat people, settle in Quebec City, Montreal, Ontario, and the eastern United States. Many came to Westport, Ontario, in the Rideau Lakes district, where they carved a new life out of the bush, building cabins in the old style on government-granted land. Today, the Murphys host a Hannah reunion.
Coming up into this area here, you could take a slice Ireland off, pick it up, drop it up here in this country, right here, and drop here in Westport, and it's the same people, it's the same names, the same people live down the street, the same houses, the same everything. So when you came, if you're writing back, and it's too bad nobody, or you can never get those, the correspondence back and forth, you'd wonder that everybody would say it's a great country. Listen, it took us a year, but we own, we talked about that.
It's hard to do, but
hey, we did it. We have ownership of land here. It's good.
When Barney Murphy died, and he was a year to 2 years old on the Hannah, when he died, He owned 1,000 acres of land. His father, John, in Ireland, owned 4 acres of land.
And that was big.
And that was big.
Didn't own, Mum. Did not own.
Excuse me, didn't. Right, Tom. Right.
Never owned.
No, right.
Never owned.
Right. Rented.
If there is a house haunted by the famine, it's here. The home Barney McGinn built for his wife and 6 children as they fled the famine aboard the Hannah.
Captain Marshall's autobiography said that he was in Quebec waiting for her. She got off the Hannah by herself, and he also states that she was badly frostbitten. She has no children. They've all drowned or frozen to death. That wasn't the end of it. She came here, she totally anguished, like a mother, and lose all of your children. And did he blame her? Did she blame him? What kind of a life did they have after that? They might just as well have died and gone down in the Hannah. She might just well herself. Like, the tragedy for her and for him and for Barney Fair never ended. Who do you blame? There's this stupid 23-year-old captain who abandons them on the ice. There you've got all these other families, like they're Irish Catholics. They have huge families. They had those large families on that Hannah, and they're losing all these children. And everybody, like, what kind of a life did they have after that?
My name is Patrick Carr, and I offer this rose as a mark of respect to all the people who had to stay behind in Ireland and never had the opportunity of a new life.
My name is Jane Murphy, and I'd like to drop this rose in memory of Anne McGinn, who lost all 6 of her children.
My name is Tom Murphy. Dedicate this rose to my great-great-grandfather, John Murphy, who lost his 2 twins and floated away on the ice.
My name is Sharon Donnelly Carher, and I'd like to offer this rose for all the children that were lost so far from home.